My mom assigned each child a permanent flaw at birth and punished us whenever we tried to be anything else. My mother assigned us permanent flaws within hours of birth and spent the next 2 decades enforcing them with methodical cruelty. I was the angry one because I cried loudly in the delivery room. My brother Felix was the clumsy one because he dropped a rattle during his first week. My sister Iris was the scared one because she startled easily as an infant. My youngest brother Owen was the selfish one because he refused to share a toy at 18 months. Mom wrote these designations in a leather journal she called the Family Truth Book, where she documented every incident that proved her initial assessments correct. She kept it locked in her desk and showed it to teachers, doctors, and family members as evidence that she understood us better than anyone. Dad left when Owen was 3, after Mom broke Felix's fingers for successfully tying his shoes without fumbling. He said watching her destroy us was killing him, but he couldn't stop her. Mom told us Dad abandoned the family because he couldn't handle the truth about his defective children. The punishments for defying our flaws were precise and escalating. When I stayed calm during a stressful situation, Mom would lock me in the basement for hours until I screamed and raged enough to satisfy her that my anger was still intact. She'd stand at the top of the stairs, telling me that suppressing my true nature was dangerous and would lead to worse explosions later. When Felix successfully completed physical tasks without mistakes, Mom would sabotage his efforts by hiding his homework or breaking his projects, then punishing him for the resulting failures. She told him repeatedly that his clumsiness was genetic, and trying to overcome it was pointless vanity. Iris got punished for any display of courage or confidence by being locked in dark closets or forced to watch horror movies until she was properly terrified again. Owen's consequences for sharing or showing kindness involved Mom taking away his possessions and giving them to strangers while telling him this was what happened when selfish people pretended to care about others. We learned early that fighting our assigned flaws brought more pain than accepting them. Mom built our entire home environment around reinforcing our flaws. She bought Felix shoes 2 sizes too big and pants that dragged on the ground so he'd trip constantly. She moved furniture randomly so he'd bump into things and rearranged his room weekly so he couldn't develop spatial memory. For Iris, she installed motion sensor lights that would suddenly go dark and speakers that played random loud noises throughout the house. She kept poisonous plants and aggressive dogs around to give Iris legitimate things to fear. Owen's belongings were kept in locked cabinets he had to ask permission to access. Mom would give him 1 cookie, then make him watch while she gave his siblings 3 each, explaining that selfish children didn't deserve equal treatment. My room was painted red, which Mom said was scientifically proven to increase aggression. She'd provoke me with insults and accusations, then act satisfied when I finally snapped and yelled back. She documented everything in her journal with dates and detailed descriptions of how we'd tried to deviate from our flaws and how she'd corrected us back to our true natures. School became another battleground where Mom's system followed us. She met with teachers at the start of every year to explain our flaws and demand they accommodate them. Felix got seated away from lab equipment and wasn't allowed to participate in physical education because of his dangerous clumsiness. Iris was excused from presentations and group work due to severe anxiety that Mom claimed was a diagnosed disorder, though we'd never seen a real doctor about it. Owen was banned from sharing supplies or working collaboratively because teachers were warned he'd steal from other students. I was put on behavior plans that assumed I'd be violent and aggressive, requiring me to sit in a separate area of the classroom under constant monitoring. Mom provided the school with thick files of documentation from her journal showing years of incidents that proved her assessments. Teachers who questioned her claims would receive lengthy emails detailing how they were enabling dangerous behaviors by not enforcing the accommodations. Most of them eventually gave up and just followed her instructions. By the time I was 15, I'd spent a decade being told my anger was my defining characteristic and any attempt to be calm or peaceful was fake. Mom had convinced child services, social workers, and school counselors that I had severe behavioral issues requiring constant supervision. She'd fabricated incidents and coached my siblings to confirm her stories about my violent outbursts. I'd been suspended 3 times for fights I didn't start but couldn't prove my innocence because Mom had already established a narrative that I was the problem. Felix was 16, and had developed a genuine coordination problem from years of being forced to fail at physical tasks. His confidence was destroyed, and he actually was clumsy now because he'd been conditioned to doubt every movement. Iris was 14 and had panic attacks regularly because Mom had spent years terrifying her on purpose. Owen was 11 and had started hoarding food and supplies in his room because he'd internalized that he didn't deserve to have needs met. We were becoming the flaws Mom had assigned us. The worst part was realizing she was doing this on purpose. Our first real attempt to break free came when Felix found Mom's journal during one of her trips to visit her sister. He photographed every page and sent them to our phones, creating a backup before she could destroy evidence. The entries were detailed and calculating, showing exactly how she'd manufactured situations to reinforce our flaws. She'd documented breaking Felix's projects with pride. She'd written about introducing new fears to Iris's environment systematically. She'd described provoking me into anger, then using my reactions as proof of my flaw. For Owen, she'd kept track of every item she'd taken from him and given away, including a birthday gift from our grandmother that he'd cried over losing. Reading her cold clinical descriptions of how she manipulated us felt like having our reality confirmed and shattered simultaneously. She wrote about us as experiments, as subjects in her personal study of whether children could be shaped into predetermined flaws through consistent environmental pressure. She considered herself a success. I started researching online about parental abuse and found forums where other people described similar systematic control. I learned terms like gaslighting and manufactured dependency and deliberate traumatization. Everything Mom did had a name and a pattern that other people recognized. I found a legal aid website that offered free consultations and called from the school library. The attorney I spoke with was named Thomas Vaughn, and he listened to my story without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment before saying what Mom was doing constituted child abuse and that the journal Felix had photographed was evidence of premeditated harm. He said I needed to get copies of any medical records, school records, and the journal documentation to multiple safe locations immediately. He explained that proving systematic psychological abuse was harder than proving physical abuse, but the journal entries showing intent and planning would be powerful evidence. He gave me his direct number and told me to call if the situation escalated or if we needed emergency intervention. Mom discovered the journal was photographed when she noticed Felix had moved it slightly. She checked the photo metadata on the camera she kept hidden in our rooms and saw he'd taken pictures of the pages. Her rage was controlled and terrifying. She called a family meeting that evening and laid out new rules. No phones except during designated hours when she'd monitor everything we did on them. No privacy in our rooms because we'd proven we couldn't be trusted. No contact with anyone outside the family without her approval and presence. Felix tried to argue, and she slapped him so hard his head snapped back. Then she told him this was exactly why she had to protect him from himself, because his clumsiness extended to decision-making. She took all our phones and laptops and said we'd get them back when we'd earned the privilege through proper behavior, but she didn't know Felix had already uploaded the photos to a cloud account she didn't know existed. We still had access through the school computers. Thomas filed a report with Child Protective Services on my behalf after I sent him the journal photos through a secure portal at the library. The caseworker assigned to investigate was named Patricia Levine, and she showed up unannounced 3 days later while Mom was at work. She interviewed each of us separately, starting with Owen, who was too scared to say anything contradicting Mom's version of reality. Iris had a panic attack during her interview and couldn't complete it. Felix told Patricia everything, but she seemed skeptical about the systematic nature of what he described. When Patricia interviewed me, I stayed calm and factual, showing her the journal photos on the school tablet I'd borrowed. I explained exactly how Mom had assigned us flaws at birth and spent years enforcing them through punishment and environmental manipulation. Patricia's expression changed as she read the journal entries. She said she needed to consult with her supervisor and would be back in contact soon. Mom came home while Patricia was still there, and her performance was masterful. She cried about how difficult it was, raising 4 troubled children alone after their father abandoned them. She said she'd been keeping the journal as a way to track our issues and help therapists understand our needs. She made herself look like a devoted mother, overwhelmed by circumstances. The investigation went nowhere initially, because Mom's documentation made her look credible. She had years of emails to teachers describing our behavioral issues. She had incident reports she'd filed with the school about our problems. She had letters from our former pediatrician who she'd fed information to about our difficulties. CPS concluded that while Mom's methods might be unconventional, she was trying her best with limited resources and challenging children. Patricia told me during a follow-up call that without evidence of physical abuse or medical neglect, it was hard to prove psychological harm, especially when Mom had such extensive documentation of our issues. She said the case would remain open, but they couldn't remove us from the home based on what they'd found. I asked her if she'd actually read the journal entries where Mom explicitly stated she was manufacturing our flaws on purpose. Patricia said the journal could be interpreted as a parent's frustrated venting rather than evidence of deliberate abuse. She advised us to reach out if the situation worsened. I hung up, feeling defeated and trapped. Mom's retaliation for the CPS investigation was subtle and devastating. She started homeschooling us, claiming the school environment was too triggering for our various issues. This isolated us completely from potential witnesses or support systems. She created elaborate daily schedules that kept us busy and exhausted. Felix had to complete physical tasks designed to make him fail over and over. Iris had to face her fears in controlled exposure exercises that were actually just torture sessions. Owen had to practice sharing by giving away his belongings to charity every week. I had anger management exercises that involved Mom provoking me until I lost control, then punishing me for it. She documented everything in her journal, showing how dedicated she was to helping us overcome our flaws through intensive home therapy. She even started a blog about parenting difficult children, where she wrote sanitized versions of what she did to us, framing herself as a martyr, dealing with genetic disorders and behavioral problems. Her blog got popular in certain parenting communities. People praised her dedication and asked for advice about their own troubled kids. Felix broke first under the pressure. He was 17 and couldn't take another year of deliberate failure and degradation. He stole money from Mom's wallet and ran away in the middle of the night, leaving a note saying he'd rather be homeless than clumsy. Mom called the police and filed a missing person report describing Felix as mentally unstable and likely to hurt himself due to his coordination issues. She gave them the journal entries about his clumsiness as evidence of his impairment. She cried on camera during a local news segment about her missing son, begging him to come home. The performance was convincing enough that people in the community started looking for Felix, thinking they were helping a disabled teenager in danger. Felix lasted 4 days on the streets before police found him sleeping in a park and brought him home. Mom hugged him in front of the officers, thanking them for saving her baby. Once they left, she locked him in his room for 2 weeks with minimal food, telling him this was what happened when clumsy people tried to navigate the world alone. She said he'd proven her point about needing supervision. I reached out to Thomas again through the school library before Mom pulled us out. I told him about the escalating situation and Felix's failed escape attempt. Thomas said we needed more than just the journal now. We needed testimony from outsiders who'd witnessed Mom's behavior or evidence of tangible harm. He suggested trying to get medical evaluations done by doctors Mom didn't control or finding teachers willing to testify about the accommodations she'd demanded. He said the blog she'd started could actually help our case if we could prove she was lying about the nature of our conditions. He asked if I'd be willing to undergo a psychological evaluation with an independent evaluator who could assess whether I actually had the anger issues Mom claimed. I agreed immediately. Thomas connected me with a forensic psychologist named Dr. Yolanda Ruiz, who specialized in cases of parental alienation and manufactured disorders. She interviewed me over 3 video sessions using a borrowed laptop at a friend's house when I could sneak out. Her evaluation concluded I showed no signs of pathological anger or behavioral disorders. Instead, I displayed symptoms of complex trauma from long-term psychological abuse. Dr. Ruiz's evaluation gave us ammunition, but we needed more to overcome Mom's extensive documentation. Thomas suggested getting Felix and Iris evaluated as well. Felix snuck out to meet Dr. Ruiz, and she determined his coordination problems were psychological, not physical, and stemmed from conditioned learned helplessness. Iris's evaluation showed severe anxiety disorder directly caused by environmental trauma, not genetic predisposition. Owen was too young and too controlled to get him to a session safely. Dr. Ruiz wrote detailed reports explaining how our mother had systematically created the very problems she claimed were inherent flaws. She described Mom's approach as Munchausen syndrome by proxy, combined with systematic psychological torture. Her reports used strong language about the deliberate nature of Mom's abuse and the calculated way she documented her own crimes in her journal. Thomas filed a new report with CPS, including all 3 evaluations and Dr. Ruiz's expert opinion. This time, the investigation was taken more seriously. The second CPS investigation brought a different caseworker named Gregory Kwan, who seemed more experienced and skeptical of Mom's performance. He reviewed all of Dr. Ruiz's evaluations and compared them against Mom's journal entries, finding clear contradictions. When Mom claimed we had genetic disorders, Gregory asked for medical records proving diagnoses. She couldn't provide any because she'd never actually taken us to specialists. When she claimed teachers had reported our behavioral issues, Gregory contacted the schools directly and found that Mom had been the source of most reports, not independent observers. Teachers described feeling pressured by Mom to accommodate problems they hadn't actually witnessed. Gregory interviewed neighbors who said we seemed like normal kids when Mom wasn't around. He spent 3 hours reading Mom's blog and comparing it to her journal entries, finding that the blog sanitized and misrepresented what she actually did to us. His report to CPS recommended immediate removal of all children from the home, pending further investigation. Mom fought the removal order with a lawyer she hired who specialized in family defense. The hearing was scheduled quickly, and Thomas represented us as legal counsel, though technically CPS was supposed to be advocating for our interests too. Mom's lawyer argued she was a devoted single mother being persecuted for unconventional but loving parenting methods. He presented all her documentation as evidence of her commitment to helping us. He claimed Dr. Ruiz's evaluations were biased because we'd been coached by CPS to lie about our mother. He said removing us from our home would cause more trauma than leaving us in Mom's care. Thomas countered with the journal entries showing Mom's explicit intent to create and maintain our flaws. He presented Dr. Ruiz, who testified about the systematic nature of the abuse and the manufactured quality of our supposed disorders. She explained how Mom had created self-fulfilling prophecies by treating us as though we had flaws until we developed real problems from the abuse. The judge read selected journal entries aloud in court. Hearing Mom's cold, clinical descriptions of breaking Felix and terrifying Iris and provoking me, spoken in a judge's voice, made the abuse undeniable. The judge ordered immediate removal and placed us in temporary foster care while criminal charges were being considered. We got split up initially because finding a foster home that could take 4 kids together was difficult. Felix and I went to one home while Iris and Owen went to another about 30 minutes away. The first week felt surreal. Our foster parents, Greg and Simone, were kind, but seemed overwhelmed by the situation. They didn't know how to handle Felix's genuine clumsiness that Mom had created, or my hypervigilance about anger that made me afraid to show any emotion. Simone tried to reassure us that we were safe, but years of conditioning made it impossible to believe adults who said they wanted to help. Felix had nightmares about Mom finding us and finishing what she'd started. I kept expecting her to show up and prove she'd been right all along about our flaws. The second week was harder because we started processing what had actually happened. Felix broke down crying one night, saying he didn't know who he was without the clumsiness, because that's all he'd ever been allowed to be. I understood completely. If I wasn't the angry one, then who was I? Mom got arrested 3 weeks after we were removed and charged with 4 counts of child abuse and 4 counts of endangering the welfare of children. The charges were based on the journal entries, Dr. Ruiz's evaluations, and testimony from Gregory about the systematic nature of the abuse. Mom's lawyer got her released on bail, and she immediately started a public relations campaign, claiming she was being persecuted for her parenting choices. Her blog followers rallied around her, organizing protests outside the courthouse and sending hateful messages to CPS workers. They believed Mom's version of events, where she was a martyr, dealing with severely troubled children who'd been turned against her by an overreaching government. The narrative gained traction in certain circles that were already skeptical of CPS. Mom gave interviews to sympathetic media outlets describing herself as a victim of politically correct parenting standards that didn't allow discipline. She never mentioned the journal entries or the evaluations proving she'd manufactured our problems deliberately. Her supporters didn't seem interested in facts that contradicted their beliefs about parental rights. Thomas filed a motion to keep the journal entries and evaluations unsealed as public record so Mom couldn't control the narrative. The judge agreed, ruling that the nature of the charges and the public attention warranted transparency. Local news outlets got access to the documents, and several ran stories about the disturbing details of systematic psychological abuse. One reporter, named Keisha Washington, did a long investigative piece that included interviews with former teachers and neighbors. She found a pattern of Mom isolating us and controlling information about us. She discovered Mom had been fired from her job as a research assistant at a university psychology department years ago for ethical violations involving an experiment on conditioning behavior in children. That experiment had been shut down, and Mom had been banned from working with human subjects. Keisha connected the dots, showing Mom had essentially continued her unethical research on her own children. The story went regional, then national. Child development experts were interviewed expressing horror at the systematic way Mom had damaged us. The blog followers mostly disappeared once the journal entries became public and people could read Mom's own words about breaking us on purpose. The criminal trial took 8 months to prepare. Thomas worked with the prosecutor to build a case that would hold Mom accountable, not just for abuse, but for the premeditated, calculated nature of it. They used the journal as the centerpiece, showing years of documented evidence that Mom knew exactly what she was doing and did it anyway. They brought in expert witnesses to explain the psychological damage from being systematically conditioned to believe you had inherent permanent flaws. Dr. Ruiz testified again, describing how each of us had developed real disorders from Mom's manufactured conditions and how long recovery would take. Felix testified about the physical pain from deliberately clumsy movements and the shame of failing constantly at tasks he could have mastered. Iris described the terror of living in an environment designed to frighten her and the lasting impact of being conditioned to fear everything. I testified about being punished for calmness and taught that anger was my only authentic emotion. Owen was deemed too young to testify, but Gregory read his statements about having belongings taken away and being told he was selfish for wanting normal things kids should have. The jury heard days of testimony about systematic destruction of children's sense of self. Mom's defense was that she'd been trying to help us accept our limitations rather than developing false confidence that would lead to disappointment. Her lawyer argued the journal was therapeutic writing, where she processed her frustration, not evidence of intentional harm. He claimed the flaws she'd assigned us were based on legitimate observations of our natural tendencies, not arbitrary designations. He said conditioning us to accept reality was protective parenting, not abuse. He presented character witnesses who'd known Mom before her firing and described her as dedicated to understanding child development. None of them knew about the journal or the specific things she'd done to us. Mom took the stand and performed remorse, claiming she'd made mistakes, but always had our best interests at heart. She cried, talking about how much she loved us and how devastating it was to lose her children. She said the journal was taken out of context and that she'd never intended to hurt us. The prosecutor destroyed her credibility on cross-examination by reading specific journal entries where Mom expressed satisfaction at successfully breaking Felix's confidence or pleasure at inducing new fears in Iris. Mom couldn't explain away her own documented enjoyment of our pain. The jury convicted on all counts after 3 hours of deliberation. The judge scheduled sentencing for a month later, giving time for victim impact statements and evaluation of Mom's mental state. During that month, we were allowed to submit written statements about how Mom's abuse had affected us. Felix wrote about physical therapy for coordination problems that were psychological and about struggling to trust his own body. Iris described medication for anxiety and ongoing therapy for trauma responses. I wrote about anger management that wasn't managing anger, but unlearning the belief that anger was my identity. Owen wrote about hoarding behaviors and difficulty accepting that he deserved to have needs met. The statements were heartbreaking compilations of damage that would take years to undo. Dr. Ruiz submitted her professional opinion that Mom showed no genuine remorse and represented ongoing danger to children. She recommended the maximum sentence and permanent prohibition from contact with any of us. The prosecutor requested 20 years in prison for the systematic nature of the abuse and the documented premeditation. The sentencing hearing was packed with people who'd followed the case, including some of Mom's former blog followers who'd turned against her after reading the journal entries. The judge spent 30 minutes explaining her decision before announcing the sentence. She described Mom's abuse as among the most calculated and cruel she'd encountered in 20 years on the bench. She noted that Mom had deliberately created psychological damage in her children, then documented it as though conducting an experiment. She said the journal entries showed someone who viewed her children as subjects rather than human beings deserving of love and protection. She sentenced Mom to 15 years in prison on each count to run consecutively with credit for time served. She issued a permanent restraining order prohibiting Mom from any contact with us directly or through third parties. She terminated Mom's parental rights permanently. Mom showed no reaction during the sentencing, sitting perfectly still as though the judgment didn't apply to her. As bailiffs led her away, she looked at each of us in turn, but her expression was blank and cold. There was no love or regret, just calculation, as though she was still trying to figure out how we'd escaped her control. Felix, Iris, Owen, and I were eventually placed together in a specialized foster home run by a couple named Angela and David, who'd trained specifically in helping severely traumatized children recover. They understood that we'd need years of therapy and patience as we figured out who we were without the flaws Mom had assigned us. Felix started physical therapy and occupational therapy to rebuild coordination and confidence in his body. Within 3 months, he could complete tasks he'd been failing at for years, discovering he wasn't actually clumsy at all. Iris worked with a trauma therapist who specialized in anxiety disorders and gradually reduced her panic attacks through real exposure therapy that built coping skills instead of manufacturing fear. Owen saw a child psychologist who helped him understand that having needs was normal and healthy, not selfish. I worked through my relationship with anger, learning to experience and express it appropriately instead of believing it defined me completely. We all had setbacks and difficult days when Mom's conditioning reasserted itself, but having each other helped us remember the truth about who we'd been before she decided otherwise. The hardest part of recovery was accepting that Mom had been wrong about us from the beginning and that the flaws she'd assigned were never real. Felix wasn't naturally clumsy. Iris wasn't inherently scared. Owen wasn't fundamentally selfish. I wasn't essentially angry. We'd been normal children who Mom decided to damage for her own twisted purposes. Understanding that intellectually was different from believing it emotionally after 20 years of conditioning. Felix still hesitated before physical tasks, occasionally convinced he'd fail. Iris still startled at unexpected noises sometimes. Owen still hoarded supplies in his room, even though he had unrestricted access to everything. I still monitored my emotional responses constantly, afraid of being too angry or not angry enough. Our therapists said this was normal, that deprogramming from systematic abuse took as long as the abuse itself had lasted. They reminded us that healing wasn't linear, and that bad days didn't mean we weren't making progress. Slowly, we started believing them. Slowly, we started believing ourselves. 2 years after Mom's sentencing, we were all in different stages of recovery, but making real progress. Felix had gotten a part-time job at a bookstore and was taking community college classes in literature. He moved confidently and rarely stumbled anymore. Iris had finished high school and was applying to colleges for art programs, having discovered she loved painting after years of being too frightened to try creative activities. Owen was thriving in middle school, making friends and joining clubs without constantly worrying about being selfish. I'd graduated high school and was working while figuring out what I wanted to study, having discovered I was actually pretty calm and thoughtful when I wasn't being deliberately provoked. We still had family dinners at Angela and David's house where we could just be ourselves without assigned flaws or constant monitoring. We still had hard conversations about the years we'd lost and the damage we were still healing from. But we also had moments of normalcy and joy that Mom had never allowed. We laughed together without wondering if we were being too happy. We supported each other without fear of punishment. We were becoming people instead of flaws. 3 years after sentencing, Angela and David helped us get copies of Mom's journal from the court records. We wanted to read it together as adults with enough distance and healing to process what Mom had written about us. The entries were worse than we remembered, confirming that every action she'd taken was deliberate and calculated. She'd written about breaking Felix with satisfaction. She'd documented frightening Iris as though describing a successful experiment. She'd described provoking me to anger as achieving desired results. For Owen, she'd kept detailed records of items taken away, as though tracking data points. There was no love in her words, just clinical observation and methodical destruction. Reading it together was painful, but also validating. We hadn't been crazy or oversensitive or ungrateful. Mom had been systematically abusing us and documenting it in her own handwriting. Having that confirmation helped us let go of lingering guilt about reporting her and testifying against her. We'd done the right thing by escaping and by making sure she couldn't hurt anyone else. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.